I'm going to get started now. Thank you all for joining. It's been an exciting time for me because I personally have been involved with strategies to do remote work for a long time now, people who know me. And I have been doing a lot of research into the neuroscience, and I've connected to quite a few people in my network. And today, we're going to talk about the neuroscience of learning, of anxiety, as to how we mitigate some of these challenges. And so my name is Utukuri. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Vizetto. I have been involved in the forefront of research relating to remote learning for about 5-6 years. And I have an exciting speaker here today, Dr. Noel Amaladoss. He's not only a clinical psychiatrist who deals with the forefront of technology, ADHD, how remote work is affecting our anxiety, but he's also an assistant professor at McMaster who is in the behavioral neurosciences. It took me a few times to practice that because I kept muddling it up. So here's my objectives today, or our objectives today. We're going to help you understand the conditions that cause stress and lack of attention. If you feel like you're tuning out in all of those endless remote meetings, you're not alone. We're going to talk about why. Then we're going to talk about strategies to go ahead and effect change in you and your organization. And I'm going to also talk about emerging technologies. This is a greenfield opportunity where things are coming out at you like left, right, and center. We're going to talk to you about what to go take a look at. So first up, from a stats point of view, we all know this. Work has changed and it's never going to come back to being the same. So here's the actual stat from a clinical paper point of view. 5% of people were working 3 times a week before the pandemic. Today, 37% is full-time, right? So you literally went from 1% full-time to 37% full-time. That's an incredible increase within a small span. And 54% of people are saying to leave their job. You're talking about the Great Migration. And 46% actually expressed loneliness. So these are huge topics that we're going to discuss today. And without further ado, I am going to introduce you to Dr. Amaladoss. Come on in.
Perfect. Thank you, Avni, and hello to everyone out there. Thank you for inviting me into your homes and your lives. And I wanted to share with you some of my thoughts. And when Avni and I decided to put this presentation together, it sort of came from this long-standing period of people. The world has changed, and that's putting it quite mildly. But what I wanted to sort of share with you as a sort of introduction is really thinking about the brain. 100 billion neurons is operating in the brain. It operates or uses up 20% of the energy resources, and yet the brain is less than 2% of the body mass. So this elusive organ still almost remains the final frontier and has generated a flurry of very exciting research that I'd hopefully like to share with you. Because in the context of this ever-changing world, our brain has had to adapt. And just watching so many of you trying to attend this call, trying to learn things from the offices in between meetings, puts some unique strains on the system. And understanding the system is what I'd like to try to orientate you through. So by way of introduction, this pandemic has really changed the world. But I would go as far as to say that researchers have been using the word syndemic. We specifically use that word because a syndemic refers to a confluence of different pandemics, as well as the interaction between your social, your biological, and your environmental factors. And I'll show you over the next few slides how to think a little bit about how this syndemic nature seems to be affecting us. Now we've all heard about the mental health epidemic. I mean, so many people close to us have been struggling. Everything from mood problems to increased levels of anxiety symptoms, increased rates of stress, and a number of researchers across the world through the course of the pandemic have been studying this. In one particular paper, they addressed what are some of the mental health challenges that people face. We can see increased levels of anxiety, increased levels of stress. Insomnia rates have become much higher. I mean, we can all relate to even just sleep difficulties. So we're seeing a surge of mental health related difficulties. And on top of that, massive rates of job loss. I mean, OECD rates have talked about 15 years of job creation lost in 6 weeks. Oxfam data show that in Bangladesh, 1 million people were laid off in a very short period of time, driving already major rates of stress and major rates of poverty. So, as we can see, and as we're sort of pivoting in this world, we've all felt the strains of how job loss as well can affect each of us. And so another data that sort of tracked sort of US data showed a much higher proportion of the population who were in steady jobs actively worrying about the security of their jobs. So not only are we faced with this massive viral epidemic, mental health difficulties, but the security blanket with which we spend the bulk of our lives was also shooken up. A silent but yet ever prevalent epidemic is that of the loneliness epidemic. Now, we're much more connected than we were at any point in our lives, but the rates of loneliness have doubled since the 1980s. What does that say? Now, the Surgeon General of the US, Vivek Murthy, went on to make a statement that loneliness poses one of the biggest health risks to us all. But yet it's the silent epidemic that's not often reserved to the elderly. We're all susceptible to it. But loneliness isn't just a sociological problem. If we look at some of the data, and this has been replicated a number of times, look at the evidence around well-being, physical health, its effect on sleep, its effect on cognition, as well as exacerbating underlying mood problems. So it's something that we just can't ignore. So as you can see, these confluence of the different factors are sort of coming together to exacerbate our conditions.
Well, actually, I had a quick thing. That's a really interesting comment about loneliness. And even though in the pandemic right now, I personally feel lonely at the larger sense. I feel like I'm connected to my immediate family. What are you seeing from the loneliness point of view at the population in general? Are they lonely related to work as well?
Absolutely. I mean, loneliness is, so when you sort of think about loneliness, Emil Durkheim was really the pioneer who did a lot of this. And his work was really studied in the 60s and 70s, and he specifically looked at how loneliness affects mental health. Now, take for example, you and I, you're watching me from your offices, you're looking at the screen. It's so nice for us to sort of be able to see your faces and see your gestures, every now and again looking at your backgrounds and what your homes look like. But what's happening, unfortunately, is this idea of social capital is what is the entity. So people want to be understood, you know, they want to be they want to be sort of known for who they are. They want to be able to be in trusting relationships. And as you can see from some of the challenges with the pandemic, the job loss, trust is something that you have to maintain. So if somebody is, for example, on the other side of the screen, how are they going to trust you? You know, so the screens and the way in which we're working with technology sometimes serves as a barrier to our connections. So that's sort of how the theory of how loneliness ties in.
Virtual connections are not the same as the real ones, absolutely.
Absolutely,
awesome.
Absolutely. And so when we sort of say work has changed, I mean, it's a dramatic understatement. But we've had to do massive pivoting, you know. Now, just as much as professionals, so much like yourselves, have been celebrating the 30-second commute, companies have quite noticed that the big ticket items on their spreadsheets, such as real estate, are actually not that profitable. So the companies have also realized that we can get people to work from home. We can reduce our footprint on real estate and still be profitable. So what this has done is sort of we've all had to sort of do these massive pivoting and shifting in terms of working from home in order to maintain. But the challenge is, innately, boundaries get blurred, you know? Look at this poor gentleman trying to sort of hold his baby, at the same time do his drawings, at the same time do homework. And we have these massive competing interests that are sort of, we have to balance all the time. So we're going to have to procrastinate. We're going to put tasks off that require more of our attention. But yet there's still this anxiety about missing some things. So how many times we, at the end of our workday, had to go back and finish things at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, just to make sure we're keeping up. So at the same time though, technology has really sort of come to help us in so many ways, you know. If we look at video conferencing, there's almost been a 250% increase from about 30 million users, and within the span of a few months, 100 million Zoom users. Right now, you and I we're connecting through this amazing platform that has sort of given us this opportunity to sort of get to know. And so this massive upsurge in technology has taken place. But at the same time though, the way we sort of think about technology is it's not the same. And we all know that, you know. Now here's some data when they specifically look at how do people interact with the digital environment and how do people interact with paper, you know, the old-fashioned way. It turns out that digital environments can be innately distracting, you know. I can imagine if you were looking at me on your screen and you had your instant messenger popping up every now and again, or an email notification, it's going to be hard to gauge, you know, or fully be present. So they're more distracting. And it turns out that they can also affect cognitive processes, and mainly because our capacity to comprehend and take away information gets blurred. And I'll show you a little bit more over the next ensuing slides, kind of how that process takes place.
So hold on. Are you saying that if I read a book, an ebook, that is actually worse off than reading a real book?
Well, it's a great point. Some of the data says that it's not the same. Or in order to be able to get the same information, you need to recruit more of the system in order to do that. So it can be distracting, but again, all ebooks, all technologies are built differently, you know?
Yes.
So me trying to read an article on my phone
Sure.
versus a certain environment could be different. But great point.
By the way, just moved forward a few clicks. Just
Okay.
go back. Yeah.
Okay. So the distracting environment is one factor to consider. The second factor to look at is really, as we were sort of, Anthony was sort of pointing out, not all technologies are built the same. You know, we've all interacted with so many different types to try to sort of make our interactions more meaningful. In this one particular study, they actually looked at 40 years of data, especially on the learning environment, and they tried to measure their effect size. So an effect size is a helpful statistical measure that measures how effective a particular intervention is. The effect size was 0.33 for technology. So it's not that bad. So if you have an effect size of, let's say, 0.2, 0.3, it's not bad. A strong effect size is more than 0.6, 0.8. But what's interesting is look at the variation in the type of technology. So on one level, we have emailing and chat taking place. On sometimes we have representational models, others we have discussion, but then we have sort of embedded technologies where you can combine video conferencing, shared experiences. And there is quite a difference in how you use technology and the types of platforms seems to also be an important marker on how engaged we are.
I have a comment on this. So
Yeah.
looking at that, okay, from a statistical point of view, the bottom says negative 0.02. Is this study actually saying casual emails and passive video conferences, you're actually unlearning? Because I'm assuming 0 means no learning.
Yeah.
1 means you're 100% absorbing anything. From a layman's term, are you saying you're unlearning things in a video conference call that are passive?
Well, it's interesting because there's actually data to show, I mean, even if I spoke to the audience, even just between now and over the next 20 minutes,
Yeah.
half their attention is going to be drifting away.
So that's a 0.5?
So that's, at the best of times, we're paying attention to only half the information.
Sure.
So how we pay attention to it seems to be important. So if it's not engaging, we're going to easily drift off.
So you're talking about 0.02 to 0.78. So my simple brain, you're talking about a magnitude of over 200 times more effective to have a shared experience versus a conference call that's passive or an email.
Well, the data seems to indicate that we really need to look at technologies not all in the same way. So really good point, Avni.
Wow, that's 200 times in difference. That's really interesting because that's massive. Because in my business, if I can get 10% more engagement from a client or a partner or a team member, that would be revolutionary. And you're saying that some of our emails and conference calls that we're having could actually be unlearning people. Okay, just wanted to make sure that I understand those numbers properly.
Absolutely, and Avni uses the term engagement, I think, and that's a key principle that keeps getting highlighted in literature. It's not just this passive consumption, you know, you really need to be engaged with the content. So by the end of this hour, if you had at least 3 or 4 points that you could take into your lives, it becomes a meaningful interaction and a good use of your time. But the type of technology and how you interact with it determines the engagement levels.
Amazing.
So now this is my favorite part of the presentation, but I think I would love to spend a bit of time just orientating you to some of the brain processes, because if we can understand what the parts of the brain are doing and how they're interacting, we'll get a little bit more of an understanding in terms of how to then modulate these different factors. Now, we're all familiar or might have heard of the amygdala. It's your fight and flight center. The lion jumped through here. Me and Avni would be running off in panic or trying to fight it away. I'm sure that would go
I just have to run faster than you.
That's right. But that's our primitive organ. It's the fight and flight organ. It keeps us safe. It keeps us alive. But unfortunately, it hasn't quite adapted. You know, there are no lions running around most of, hopefully, Mississauga and Burlington. But at the same time, the systems with which keeps us safe, increasing the sympathetic system, recruiting energy towards areas that we're going to run away, is what the amygdala does. Your hippocampus serves as your memory center. So coming into this presentation, you might have had some ideas of some of the neuroscience, you might have read articles, you might have some lived experience, and you're trying to bring some of these experiences in terms of trying to understand what I'm trying to sort of share. But the prefrontal cortex, really, with the help of dopamine, really is our executive center. The job of the prefrontal cortex is to process information. It's to attend. It's to be able to filter out things that are unnecessary. But it's also to help us with goal-directed action. You know, if the goal of your presentation or attending this is that I want to take home 2 tips that I can share with my team to make us more efficient. If I can take over 1 or 2 points that might help me with being more efficient in my day, goal-directed. So then you'll be attending to this information in a different way. And what the brain does is, brain often uses a system, and the system is called your executive functions. And you may have heard of this term. What it is, it's a set of functions and cognitive processes that helps us decide, how do I plan? How do I recruit my energy? How am I able to maintain my focus? If suddenly in between this presentation you have to attend to an email, how do I then be able to shift my attention to a different goal, but then be able to come back and attend? So this shifting, managing energy, at the same time managing your amygdala, the emotions, are what the job of the prefrontal cortex does. And when you look at the brain and brain scans, in terms of, so if I had to ask sort of Avni, who's your most valued employer at your company? You don't have to give any names.
Yes.
But Avni's mind initially goes to a focused mode. Who is my most valued employer? And there's a discrete network. But if I had to ask Avni, what's your vision for the company over the next 10 years? Suddenly, a different process takes place in the brain. So you have this focused mode, and the diffuse mode. And why that's helpful is to address specific questions, you need to recruit certain neuronal networks. But at the other times, if you are not spending time, or if you're spending time with multiple distractions, it's going to impair with what the so-called diffuse mode, where some of actually this is where a lot of the creativity seems to be happening with.
I see.
Yeah. And so, as we can see, so I'd love for, do we have a willing volunteer, or and do I have a hand up if somebody's interested in trying this experiment with me? Suddenly, I see a lot of video conferences suddenly going silent. All right, Avni, would you mind with you?
Well, actually, Colin or Thomas, like if you guys can volunteer, that'd be great.
Hi, Thomas. So Thomas, if I can get you to unmute for a second, okay? And what I'd like to show you is a neurocognitive test, okay, that helps look at brain functioning. For a second, could you read just the colors line by line to me?
Blue, red, blue, green, red, yellow, red, green, black, yellow, blue,
Fantastic.
and red.
Fantastic. Yeah, you see, what did when I asked you to do that, and first of all, I mean, well done to Thomas. I mean, that was fantastic. Actually, you made it very easy. But what was the challenge, Thomas, when you were trying to do this?
Well, to distinguish between actually what you see on the screen and what you read.
Perfect. So this is a great, and thank you very much. This illustrates to a degree some of the cognitive processing. So the instructions were, can you read the color, the brain? But the actual word is much more commoner to read. The rule that got activated in Thomas's brain that said, look, the rule is to read the color. Now in that moment, your prefrontal cortex sends the instruction. Your amygdala is fearing, oh boy, I better not make the mistake. But then your anterior cingulate is your error detection. So just as much as you're about to say it, the rule gets activated. So this is a helpful model that takes place in a microseconds all the time. It's pretty fascinating when we think about how many complex interactions. Do I take the highway? Do I answer my phone if I'm about to take the exit? We're faced with so many competing interests, and that's why your prefrontal cortex helps you out with this.
So as a sales guy, I put up a deck in front of my customer in a remote meeting. So what you're saying is my brain has made up what I want to read or infer from that deck in a microsecond, and I tune everything that you say out.
You would be surprised. So Avni's question about, can you selectively listen to attention? Turns out, yes. We often tend to engage with material that confers and fits with our belief system. But sometimes you want to challenge the notion.
Right.
In order to do that, you have to go outside of your box.
So does anybody here have issues with their clients not paying attention in a remote call, and you're reinforcing something over and over again, and they just still come back a week later going, oh yeah, you guys, do you have that feature? Can this happen? Can that happen? And you're like, I covered that. I spoke about it.
Absolutely. So a lot of practical applications that you can sort of identify with. Good example.
Right.
So now we've just sort of gone, so I've sort of illustrated quite quickly the anatomy of the brain, how the prefrontal cortex acts as a filter. Now, if you look a little bit more in terms of what are these cognitive processes we're talking today about, the effect on technology, what exactly is happening? So, to illustrate this, as I said, imagine 50% of your mind is going to be wandering between now and the presentation finishes, even despite your best efforts. Tons of research has sort of pointed out to this. Now, in today's presentation, the stakes are not that high, but what if this was a high stakes meeting? What if this was a very important thing with consequences? So our attentional system seems to be something that can sort of elude us. And there has been more research and some discussion about how people tend to struggle with the engagement when you're working with online environments. How that your attention or lack of it can foster multitasking. And it almost becomes like this crowding out phenomenon. There's so much brain space that you have, but yet it gets hijacked by so many other different cognitive processes. Do I differentiate this process? Do I attend to this? Am I making a mistake? So what ends up happening, you have this crowding out phenomenon, but then what happens is this chronic state of distraction that follows us. So yes, our work calls might be finishing at 6 o'clock, 6:30, but then how do we attend to our family? Do we pay attention to our child at the dinner table? You know, do we pay attention to our spouse? How does that distraction follow us through? And this has become written about, which is something that we need to bear in mind if we're going to manage this new environment. Another analogy is, we've been at these lovely cocktail networking events, you know, you're standing across, you're meeting all kinds of different people, and for a moment I'm chatting with Avni, and we're having this great discussion, and sometimes Avni might not be as interested with what I have to say, but he's looking and he's attending. Out of the corner of his ear, he hears his name, Avni. So suddenly what happens, Avni, you know?
Oh, sorry, great meeting you. I'm going to go over here and I'll catch up with you later.
So that's one approach. Some of us, what we do is we would continue to pretend that we're interested and try to nod and gesture, but quietly we're droning Avni out. At the same time, we're focusing on, why is my name being called? Am I in trouble? Is this important? Should I be, what's my exit
Was it my wife?
So what happens, you get this diffusion, or the resolution of the content tends to sort of decrease. And so you're paying attention. This seems to be what happens with multitasking. Now the idea of multitasking seems really interesting, and sometimes we embrace this idea. But what a lot of data is actually showing is that it actually can be quite a costly benefit to these cognitive processes. It actually, when we think about multitasking, it isn't so much multitasking, it's task shifting. If now, for example, you're trying to listen to me, and again that email pops up, or that notification, you're having to shift your attention, pay attention to that cognitive set, and then come back. But if you're doing this multiple times, it ends up becoming more costly, you become more efficient with the system, and there's increased strain to the system.
So what you're saying is, back in the day, we used to close deals face to face. We used to have dinner with people and engage. These days, every remote meeting is becoming a cocktail party where we're kind of being polite and saying yes, 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 but it's hard to go ahead and make a decision. Okay, well, I find that all the time. I don't know about everybody else, but I find that I go from meeting to meeting to meeting. Back in the day when I used to fly over, meet people face to face, I used to have dinner with them, I used to build trust, I used to close, my percentage of deals a lot smaller, but focused, and the close rates were a lot higher. So you're seeing basically every remote meeting these days, people are treating like a cocktail party. I'd love to hear everybody else's thoughts too on this chat, because that really resonates with me. When Dr. Amaladoss actually told me about the cocktail party effect, I thought that was staggeringly accurate to my own experiences. But that is really interesting that in the clinical academic world, you actually have a word called the cocktail party effect.
Right. Well, if you think about it, we used to remember back in the day when you just close your door. When you closed your door, it meant you were busy, you know? No interruptions, I'm taking a meeting, I'm taking an important call, I'm working on an important project. This idea of closing the door basically said, let's attend to one complex. The more complex the task, the more efficient. But with this multitasking, and it's not so much, we're not doing this on purpose, it's just these environments and the pressures that we're all facing have dictated us, so we're having to do more with less, you know?
Absolutely.
And so being mindful of the cognitive processes, I think, can be very helpful in my understanding this.
I think that a lot of that is the sincerity of when you meet somebody in person. When you're face to face, they can truly see that you're sincere about listening and caring and so forth. But how many times I've had people write an email that when you write it, it's not meant to be bad at all. But someone perceives it as being this horrible email that you're so upset and all of a sudden now you're just, that's garbage.
Yeah.
So people buy from what they like, it's relationships. And
Absolutely.
it's a very difficult time to build relationships for what we're doing now, right? You know what I'm saying? We can friend somebody, 9 out of 10 times, they're our customer. And
Absolutely.
It's because it's sincere.
Yeah, no, that was an excellent point, Jeff. Thank you, because I mean, I didn't speak too much about the email nature, but email has almost become immediate mail. You know, this idea of, you know, like what was described as, you know, there used to be sort of the email charter that first got developed back in the 1990s. Many of us don't actually use those principles, but yet the engagement and the trust takes time, you know, and people want to be listened and understood and known on a deeper level, but we're limited by times with sort of how we can engage with that. So that was a great point, Jeff. Thank you. So to summarize, I mean, really, multitasking lowers your working memory. You know, it also, you need your working memory because I mean, one way to understand the concept of working memory is if you went to a drive-through and let's say you ordered a double-double with 2 sugars. The attendant has to then remember, okay, it's a double-double, what size was it?
And for all of our American participants here, double-double is a coffee in Canada.
Oh, it's the best. But the poor attendant has to now hold on to this information, use it in real time in order to make you the right. So working memory tends to get reduced when you're multitasking. You need your working memory eventually to lay the foundations and the neuronal network to set up good long-term memory. We also, it's also noted that there's this attentional impulsivity where our brains suddenly is starting paying attention to things that are maybe not as relevant and goal-directed. And as we said, there's almost a 40% drop in efficiency with constant multitasking. And really, there's this reset phenomenon that people talk about. So if you were going to finish this webinar and then attend to another, it takes you about 15 minutes to reorientate yourself. You know, if you're multitasking, that gets really cut in half. So where we're trying to position this is, I mean, I've spent some time trying to tell you a little bit about the world as we know it. It's changing, how it's changing, the syndemic nature of this, the stresses from working with home and the boundaries that we're having to do. But at the same time, the online, the environments with which we're interacting with can potentially be stressful. And one model to understand stress, so there's environmental stresses, there's past events, current events that are taking place. And so our poor body has to navigate stress management. And eventually what happens when you have this cumulative effect of environmental stresses, physiological stresses, it puts the strain on what we call allostatic load. Now, what we want to try to do is promote more allostasis. So that's really our body's way of trying to create homeostasis in your life. You're eating better and exercising better. So with these additional strains, the allostatic load increases and the adaptation to stress. Because human beings are quite resilient. But if we create the right environment and the circumstances, we can foster that resilience. And really, this is why the relevance of some of these cognitive processes. And in fact, the NIMH, one of the biggest researchers in mental health, is really studying cognitive processes as an important network. So it's no more just these isolated processes. It turns out that the cognitive networks and how they're affected can actually modulate various parts of mental health.
That's amazing.
So trying to put this all together to sort of say, what are some things that we can then take home in our day-to-day lives? I came across this work and I thought this was quite fascinating. This actually came from Michael Bohan from a lab within Microsoft. And what they did, it was an engineering lab, and they did something quite unique. They took a bunch of participants, and while it was a small number, about 14 or 15, they put them in back-to-back meetings. Okay, go, start all the way. And this is something we can all resonate with. And what they did, they tried to measure brain activities of stress. Now it turns out that we can measure certain markers of brain activity, one of them being your beta waves. So a higher expression of beta waves seems to indicate increased levels of stress. Have a look at the first group. They showed increased levels of beta expression and more stress. The second group still attended all the meetings, except they did one thing. They gave them a break. Every 5 minutes, not a long break, just 5 minutes, and then they also measured. The effect of beta activity didn't increase. So, pretty remarkable, but what they also did was quite interesting. They sort of understood at which points does the stress take place. They noticed that there's an upkeep at the start of the meeting and between your next meeting.
Wow.
Now, and it led the authors to conclude that it's that transitions. As we talked about, it takes about 15 minutes to transition. In this, every time there's a transition, puts more strain on the cognitive part, because the brain is saying, okay, we now have to readjust. We have to reorientate our thinking, our expectations, the next agenda meeting. And so having breaks reduced that. And quite interestingly, how engaged people were. The alpha activity, so between the two parts of the brain, shows a level of engagement. People who took more breaks were more engaged. So the other part is, so trying to be situationally aware is really what we're trying to do, and our hope in sort of today's discussion, because if we're aware of where we are, the context in which we're practicing, but also the context of how we interact, similar to how a jet fighter practices meticulously situational awareness to keep them within their optimal zone. This is really what we're trying to do in terms of promoting resiliency and health. And so some couple of strategies that you can take home today, one of them being note when you're multitasking. Multitasking is costly, is not the most efficient system, but we're not very good at knowing when we are. So just even noting, I am multitasking, how complex is the multitasking, is able to get your brain to recruit resources to address that. This is how much information can a person process. I mean, we're gone through so much information and data, but if you were able to structure or chunk the information in about 4 or 5 different groups, it makes it much easier for retrieval, makes it easier to process.
So you're saying 140 PowerPoint slides in 60 minutes where I talk nonstop is not a good strategy for chunking?
Well, turns out it's not the best, but if you can present that information in groups,
yes.
More engagement.
Yes.
Right? So things that you might be already be doing, but really what the evidence says, structure your days, have breaks, have a good morning routine. Exercising doubles the chances of improving from out of depression. In a big study that was done in schizophrenia, it increased brain growth by 12%. There's a lot of growth factors that can take place. Prefrontal cortex blood flow. So exercising regularly, a simple intervention that we can all do. Some recommendations from the previous study is that maybe consider doing a virtual commute. You know, instead of starting your morning at 9 o'clock, add in some commute time, you know, and now I believe Outlook has sort of added some features where you can actually, it's called the virtual commute, creating focus time for more complex interactions, and closing the door, you know, and when you're working on complex tasks. So really identifying multitasking, identifying the environments with which we're operating with, but the great thing about the brain is that we can do something quite unique that a lot of species don't have. We have this ability to call theory of mind. Theory of mind is think about what you're thinking about. So if your attention gets deviated, catch the drift. Notice that you're doing it. Just that act of noticing where your attention is turns out to be quite a powerful marker of improving your attention, reducing stress. Trying to stay connected with people, you know, in any meaningful, engaging way. Getting to know your employees on who they are on a deeper personal level. Building that social capital. And through it, trying to develop, so there's markers and resiliency that are quite significant. Through our work, we spend the bulk of our lives at work, but what's important, having a sense of purpose, feeling optimistic about your future, and having a positive influence on others seems to be very robust ways in which we can promote an internal sense of resiliency. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Avni and to go over a few more strategies as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. Now, what I want to do is I want to actually practically apply some of these things, because at the end of it all, what we get is we get a lot of these technology strategies, and our actual tech itself is going against all the principles that Dr. Amaladoss is talking about, okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to be mindful in meetings and why the technology actually stops you from being mindful. You know, they say talking about Facebook is a negative influence. Well, the way video conferencing tools have been designed are actually negative influences to the way that we meet today, because nobody has thought it through. Let me explain. We have never been, as a society, taught about how slides should be used. We have been taught that throw a whole bunch of information into a slide and throw it up onto our customers. It's like the regurgitate and throw up method. So here's the important thing. You have to understand your deck is a visual aid. And JP, I think you said, I want to connect with people. That's how people are built. And what happened today is your deck, your video becomes tiny, and your deck becomes huge. And when that happens, within 3 or 4 minutes, your brain disconnects. That is how video conferences have trained you to do. And then all of us turn our camera off, and it's as if you're talking to a disconnected voice. But people want to talk to people, okay? And think about the fact that if you had a first date, go back to the times that we were dating, and we all shut our cameras off and we put up a deck and we talked about our value proposition. Would you be married to the woman or man that you're actually with or dating right now? So the reality is people connect with people, and executive presence is critical in order to go make that happen. And most video conferencing tools do not do that. The second thing that he actually talked about, Dr. Amaladoss, is the ability to go ahead and have focus. Now, here's the problem with multitasking. I appreciate everything that you're saying, but I find that it is impossible for me to stop my brain from multitasking. It is absolutely impossible, because I am not in control of that multitasking scenario, right? My brain is like, as you pointed out, instead of it being 100%, I barely get 50%. So you have to be visual. And every time Dr. Amaladoss was actually... Thank you. Every time that, somehow it got muted. So every time you're actually drawing, when he was drawing and he's notating, and he's using body language to go ahead and gesture, I would like to hear if that was more engaging versus if it was not. So the ability to go ahead and ink and highlight allows your participants to gain this subconscious situational awareness. So I've been involved with a lot of companies in designing things like cockpits for aircraft. And what it is instrumentation. The best instrumentation is able to point out when there is something that you have to be aware of. If all information is displayed the same way, like we do statically in a deck, you never help the audience focus. And that's a critical aspect. Now, the other thing that you actually have to do is understand that conversations by a factor are nonlinear. Again, when we were back in the day and we were going and meeting with people and having a dinner, we had non-linear conversations. So how come we take everything into a deck and just compress it? How come we don't have the opportunity to engage? So you as a presenter have to do a whole bunch of things. You can't just go ahead and come back to the participant and say, oh, shut the door, and because none of us have the mental acuity to be able to do that. So how do I make it be non-linear? Being able to go ahead and write, bring up other content. I want my Excel file right here. I want to show a video right there. I'm going to be fluid and dynamic. The more that you're able to go ahead and bring interactivity, I would like everyone to answer a simple question. Do you feel like you're in the boardroom with me and Dr. Amaladoss today? In the last 1 hour, we wanted to create a space. Forget Meta, forget VR, forget AR, forget wearing goggles. We wanted to create a space where we invited you into our boardroom to have a nonlinear conversation. And you have to ask yourself, what is the impact of something of that to yourself? So basically what I want to now do is I am going to bring up the chat and go through some of the questions. And then I'm going to show you the technology that we're actually using here today as the last little bit. So now, from a neuroscience perspective, okay, how have mental health professionals actually dealt with this? Are they doing a good job of dealing with the pandemic and syndemic? That's one of the questions. What's your answer to that?
Well, thank you. That was such a brilliant question. In fact, there is an epidemic rate of stress. I presented some of the anxiety. I had another slide presented on the rates of burnout.
And that's even in mental health professionals?
That's in mental health. In fact, we recently published an article with myself and a group in which we talked specifically about mental health professionals. I mean, just to also illustrate the technology use, 2 days ago, I conducted some of the exams with my residents who are training to be, psychiatrists. We had to do the whole thing via Zoom. Now you can imagine the traditional notion of training and examining even changed. So we've also had to pivot and learn, but it's challenging. Like we don't have any good markers for it to go. We're trying to figure this out as we're going along.
And when I was actually talking to Dr. Amaladoss before, he actually told me in all of Canada, and including the US, there's not more than a dozen people who understand stress, ADHD, and anxiety. Most psychiatrists immediately go into a clinical formula, and it's great to go ahead and say, here, go be mindful, go do this, go do that, but none of us have the tools or the technology to go make that happen. So looking for new technologies that can actually help you. And the next question is neuroscience during remote meeting, how do you enhance engagement? So as I told you earlier on, the things that you need to do is you need to be able to stand up. Make people feel like they're talking to people, not the deck. Only about 7% of your presentation impact is going to be the deck. And we have science to show that the deck, no matter how pretty it is, how gorgeous it is only about a 7% impact. You, your delivery, your ability to be interactive is huge. Write, ink, highlight. You go to Stanford, you go to the biggest universities in the world, in the most complex classes, guess what they do? They go up and they start writing. This is critical to the way that we think and we interact. And be nonlinear. Have conversations versus be passive, where you're engaging your customers, your prospects, in order to go ahead and make an impact. So that's, now let's go through more. I think there's always a drift. How do we engage the brain? Okay, you're right. The thing is it's not the participant's job to be able to connect. Yes, they have to be mindful of you, but if you don't create an environment in which they can be mindful, they can shut things off. That's the narrative. It's coming back to chunking. If you do the wrong practices, I'm going to have an entire webinar in the future, look out for it, where I'm going to talk about taking your presentations and converting them over to a mindful, interactive, engaging experience. I'm going to show people before and after as to how these presentations can transform how you work and how you go ahead and engage. So obviously, I don't have the time to go through all of those topics, but hopefully you got the glean of it. You actually have to create the interest in order to go make it work. And creating that interest is not complicated, it's not expensive. You have to be open to that. Not everyone is in the right place. They're presenting disengaged, they don't speak volume. Not everyone is trying to receive things. So what do you do in a situation where people are not open to receiving things into a conversation? I'm sure that's an entire topic on its own, but what would you say in 30 seconds as to how do you approach that type of a situation?
So if they're not,
Speak up.
so if I understand the question is, they're not receptive to what is being presented in front of them. So then the engagement piece is not to try to bulldoze through the message, is to maybe spend some time understanding what is that disengagement about. What are the motivators for that or
So-
not for that?
So, pulling on that, to me, understanding body language and being non-linear to have a conversation is critical.
Yeah,
Would you
Yeah.
agree?
absolutely.
So here's what actually happens most of the time. When all the cameras are shut off and all we do is go ahead and linearly talk, you have no opportunity to go, sorry, wrong message, I scrolled already. You have no opportunity to go ahead and engage. I want to actually show you how we have it set up. I have an audience monitor here where the more people who turn their cameras on, and when I talk, I feel like I'm talking to an individual. So even on your desk, when you have Zoom or Teams, set up a second monitor, move the audience to a second monitor, and work on the first monitor. Have a separation. And I have the ability to go ahead and bring in from live in person, and obviously I'm just working on a big touch monitor here, but the opportunity to go ahead and engage is really a function of you reading body language and you being able to pivot. So if you're not pivoting, if you're not actually being nonlinear in your conversation, it's very hard to go ahead and bridge that gap. So how do you get folks who can't work from home understand that folks at home are actually working? That is a great point. I'm going to answer it from a technology perspective
Okay.
first and tell me if I'm right
Okay.
or wrong.
Okay.
Part of the problem is our brains are wired to process work a certain way. Okay? So I believe that when I see you working, you're in the office, you're having a coffee with me, and we're engaging and having a conversation. My brain processes that as work because we have 50,000 years of predisposed patterns that we recognize. So when you just put out output and say, here's a talk, here's a presentation, here's this, where you don't get to stand out. Actually, recently I had a VP at a major bank in Canada that popped up and said, I have a problem where I've been gunning for the senior VP position. I actually don't think that the CEOs and the senior leadership even realize how much effort that I'm putting in. I'm not standing out anymore. And I believe that, how do I go ahead and fix that? And my advice is, you got to find ways to stand out, right? You have to find ways for people to connect with you. What's your thoughts on that?
I think that's a good point. It's a fine balance, right? Because now we've sort of moved with the whole post-industrial revolution and managing professionals. There are HR processes that need to be attended to. So this is the company's challenge. On another level, the social capital says, how do we continue to build trust? How do we learn to respect people? How do we learn to treat them as, important members so that they can then not just be present and do the job, but be able to be truly engaged. So it is a balance between how do you stay true to the corporate culture, at the same time, people want to be valued as individuals, they want to be understood, and they want to be respected. So how do you foster that within a culture? One point is, when you start your meetings, instead of just going through a briefing, perhaps spend 5 minutes, tell me a little bit about yourself, tell me about your family, what are you doing this weekend? Get them to be engaged. So when they feel that they're engaged and they're not just a number, a person, I would think they would do a better job.
Well, that's amazing. So what also happens with a lot of times that I look at is I find that a lot of people get disengaged again when they disconnect from the person. I'm going to keep going back to executive presence, right? To me, executive presence, going back to your slide talking about executive functions, correct me if I'm wrong, but the visual cortex is one of the most active areas of your brain. What percentage of brain power is going towards your eyesight and visual processing from your expert opinion?
I'd have to come back to the sort of exact stat, but you're right.
60, 70, 80, 90 is high, right?
It is an important part, together with your motor, but the visual part, together with the kinesthetic learning, together with sort of, auditory learning, improves learning.
Absolutely. So if you're not creating visual interest where people feel like, this is a funny thing that I ask all the time. I want everybody to think back, give me two numbers. How many meetings have you attended per day? What's your meeting count? 5, 6, 7? And then put a slash down and tell me how many you remember from last month. On the spot, I'm going to ask you, how many meetings do you remember from last month? What's the biggest number? Come on. I want to see what the biggest number is. Okay, put down some messages over here. 5, 3. Awesome, 3. Now, here's the problem that I have. If you only remember single digits, that's 3 hours, 5 hours. Now, how many do you do a day? 5, 6, 7 a day? So generally most people are doing 100 to 150 meetings a month, but they only remember 3. If that's the ratio that we're working out of, how is anybody going to recognize your work? So you're going to go up to your boss, you're going to go up to your customers, you're going to go up to your prospects, you're going to go up to your team and go, hey, I am Mark, I'm Bob, I'm Mary, I've done 1,000 meetings. Do you remember anything? No. So when a tree falls in the forest and no one was there to hear it, did it make a sound? If you participated in all these meetings and you don't remember anything, did you actually attend or get the work done? You know, it's a really interesting concept. And one of the things in physics I remember a long time ago is the concept of work done. Did you know that if you go up a flight of stairs and come down a flight of stairs, you actually did no work? Because the potential energy that you gained actually got reduced. Let's not go into the physics of friction and heat, but in an ideal environment, when you attend a meeting and nothing is remembered, was there really work done? So I think that we have to embrace a set of technologies to really reinforce learning, reinforce memory, reinforce that type of visual interest in allowing to go ahead and make that happen. So in the last minute, I am going to talk about Reactiv Suite. So this entire product that you saw today as to how we're engaging has been created completely in a product called Reactiv Suite. So I'm going to tell you for 30 seconds, for $30 a month, you could actually go ahead and convert your meetings. And I have a cohort of people starting as early as next week where I'm going to train, I'm going to facilitate, I'm going to teach your teams how to go ahead and have impactful meetings. I'm going to show you the psychology and the neuroscience from everything that I've learned over the last 10 years. Reach out to us if you're interested, because at the end of the day, you got nothing to lose. If we can give you pointers as to how you're going to make your meetings better, how I'm going to go ahead and attract and retain more information, I'm hoping that my only ask is, and we'll spend all the time that you need in order to go ahead and get that out. So we have the last few minutes. I would love to ask any other questions that people have. First of all, I'd love to give a round of applause to Dr. Amaladoss. I hope that you found this to be informative. And I would love to hear about topics you'd like us to go ahead and cover. What would you like us to cover? What are the type of topics that would be interesting to you? If you want to bring your teams in and talk about neuroscience, would you like us to host more of these seminars? Would you be interested in, please let us know, because obviously there's an opportunity as thought leaders on future of work. We have an amazing opportunity to go engage on how we transform. I would like to go ahead and have any few last questions, and if not, please reach out. We can give you a lot more details, and we'd love to go ahead and interact with you all. Any other last questions? Awesome. Thanks again, everyone, and have a mindful day where you figure out a way to stand out in your meetings and make sure that people can connect with you. Thanks again.